and welcome to this RedMonk conversation. My name is Kate Holterhoff, Senior Analyst at RedMonk, and today my guest is Thomas Dohmke, CEO of GitHub. Thomas, I appreciate you joining me to chat about AI agents. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, and I appreciate to be in your podcast today.
So I suspect our audience doesn't know a whole lot about your background, and that's really a shame because as a sometime academic myself, it is quite impressive. Specifically, you have a PhD from the University of Glasgow in mechanical engineering. So, Dr. Dohmke, talk to me about your education, research, and early career, whatever you think would be relevant for our technical audiences to have a better sense that, when you're speaking about technology, you really know what you're talking about.
Well, I stumbled into the PhD because at the time I was working for Mercedes, so back then called Daimler Chrysler, and they didn't have a full-time position. So the only position they could offer me was a PhD position. I was like, do I want to do more academia or not? But it was kind of, you can work on the S-class and then write your thesis in Glasgow. So I actually did test-driven development for control system design. So I took the ideas of agile TDD and applied it to mechanical engineering and control system design to develop a driver assistance system for the S-class that brakes in to avoid the collision. And even that, was not my background. I taught myself coding in the early 90s. I grew up in East Berlin. The wall fell. I finally was able to buy myself a Commodore 64 and lots of books and magazines. Back in the day when you didn't have the internet and Stack Overflow, Reddit, and GitHub to learn coding, and YouTube, of course, and Moncast, and learn coding the hard way. I remember many frustrated nights. I also remember many nights where I wanted to code but played computer games instead. So it was natural for me after high school to say, okay, I want to study computer engineering in Berlin. Got into this job at Mercedes, wrote my thesis while working at Mercedes at Uni Glasgow. And then at some point I had enough of the automotive industry and decided to create a startup building iPhone apps. It was the time of the iPhone SDK and the App Store was out, and I built as a contractor apps. And at some point, a few friends and I realized there's an opportunity for us to create a company that helps mobile developers with their testing, their distribution of their beta builds, crash reporting, so collecting diagnostic information and all this kind of stuff. So we created what today probably would be called mobile DevOps, but at the time nobody called it DevOps, at least not to my memory. And that company got acquired by Microsoft and in late 2014, and that's how I got here effectively.
Wow. I'm so interested in this junction of academia and the auto industry. Do you feel like any of those early lessons have extended into what you're working on today?
It has extended both ways, I think. The cars, modern cars have become software-defined vehicles. Effectively, a car today is the computer that runs the software that you experience when you're driving the car, when you're using self-driving. And I think for most drivers, the driving experience is maybe equally important than the software experience, the navigation system, settings you can set, whatever you have on your big central screen. And if you look at Teslas and more cars, also here in Germany and in China, they update as often as does your iPhone or your Android phone. And for me, the other way around, I think, I learned two things. One is working for a big company. 2014, I joined Microsoft, and then when we acquired GitHub in 2018, GitHub became part of Microsoft. So I kind of applied the learnings twice, once to design my life at Microsoft, and then also to integrate or not integrate GitHub into Microsoft and keep certain parts independent and make sure that this, is becoming a successful acquisition for Microsoft. I think the other part is that, when I talk with customers about DevOps and AI and Copilot and all these topics, a lot of them are, embedded software developers. So a lot of them build embedded systems. While that word also has evolved, during my time at Mercedes, the control units had really small processors. They were about the same as a Commodore 64, very seriously limited in memory and bandwidth and those things. A lot of that is still true today, and embedded developers live in a very different world than a web developer that can just spin up 1,000 containers in a cluster, and if they need to scale out, they just add another 1,000 in another region. That doesn't work when you do embedded software, whether it's in your thermostat at home or your car or where else. A lot of that C++ is running.
Yeah. I think it's just important to touch on your background there, because when you talk about developers, you have a lot of empathy, and you've been in the trenches. You've really seen how projects can look over time, and you've seen it, not only from an academic perspective, but from an industry one. So let's talk about agents here, because that has been such a big part of what you've been writing about on your blog. And so, it's a conversation that we're following closely at RedMonk. It seems like everybody's talking about it right now. And I'm excited to, get your 2 cents on what we should be following here. So, just to begin with, how do you define agents? What is an agent at GitHub? Is this definition evolving? How should I be thinking about this?
Yeah, I actually have this book here, AI Engineering, and that it has the marker where the definition is. So every now and then I look it up again. So I have a profound answer that is better than what I've made up in my head. But and the book says something along the lines of, the term agent has been used in many engineering contexts. And I think the most fun example that we often forget is that your browser is called the user agent, and at least in every log file, the string, the browser string, whether it's Safari or Chrome or Edge or whatever, leaves a fingerprint in the header user agent. So it's clear, we have used that term agent in many different scenarios in software engineering for 20-ish years. I think in general you can kind of define it as something that is characterized by the environment it operates in and by the actions it takes and by the output it creates. And as such, I think whether it's your CI/CD process, your build process, you could call that an agent because you have an environment, your code or your pull request, you have a control flow actions it takes, and then it produces an output, a long log file. That is not too dissimilar from an AI agent that also looks like a build log, right? Like it generates lots of lines of output and that scroll through if you're watching it, and then you have to figure out what is it actually doing, and at some point it stops and asks you something. And so I think, in the term itself is just a different way of saying bot or workflow, pipeline, all these fit that same description. Even a batch script fundamentally is an agent, but an AI agent is different because the model defines what the agent does, right? Like all these processes I've described, they have a predefined control flow. The developer in a script or in some, program have defined what that bot does. The AI agent, we let the model define that flow, and we give it some input and some context, and that might be actually the same input and context, code and descriptions as for other agentic flows. But for AI, the model then figures out what to do itself. In the most, modern interpretation, the SWE agent, SWE agent, then the model actually loops multiple times, it reasons and looks at the output, for example, of the npm command or the maven command, and it sees there was an error message because you have a missing MySQL dependency or something like that. And then it debugs its own issue and basically can run another command to then install MySQL before rerunning that npm command. So that's, I think, where we are today with AI agents. They're taking some input in environment. They have some tools they can use, the browser, the command line, the internet, and then they create something for us that then hopefully human reviews as part of the code review process.
Yeah, one would hope. Although I've been very interested in this idea of vibe coding. I always joke that at RedMonk, we're vibe analysts. So, the idea of that, Andre Karpathy is talking about where we're vibing.
And there was a user on X the other day that used the GitHub mobile app in the shower to merge a pull request. And so we might also evolve from vibe coding to shower coding, because you can use your mobile phone as it's most of the modern smartphones are waterproof in the shower. And then with agents, you don't really need to type code. You type instructions and you can do code review on your phone and merge the pull request. And so you might get into, the world of shower coding at some point in the future.
Oh man, that is the natural evolution of vibe coding. Definitely. Yeah. Shower coding. Clearly I have some homework to do here on the shower coding
I'm sure
front.
We can add it to the show notes.
Oh yeah, please. So let's talk about GitHub Copilot's agent mode. What is that and how are folks using it?
We always said agent a lot, so let me try to put that onto the spectrum of all the tools. And so if you think about it, auto-completion and chat, they're very far on the left side. They're still very manual. The developer does most of the coding and they have an assistant. The SWE agents, they are pretty far on the other side of the spectrum. They, you assign them an issue, they build the code, they test the code, and they submit a pull request. And as always, when we do build these autonomous systems, and I'd like to compare that to self-driving cars, there's a question of what's in the middle, what's on that journey to get to that full self-driving car. Now, we both have been in San Francisco, and there you have Waymos, and they're ring-fenced within the city and well-defined, to that scenario. They know exactly what the streets of San Francisco look like on a map and so on. And then you have driver assistance systems that work outside of San Francisco, whether, it's autopilot in your Tesla or the adaptive cruise control of a Mercedes or whatnot. They are not there yet, but they help you in that mode. So agent mode is kind of like a driver assistance system. It's not the full-scale agent that you can just assign something to and it runs off and it wakes you up when you reach your destination. But it uses similar technology, models with a chain of thought. And you can, in VS Code, instead of being in chat mode, you can be in agent mode. And you can ask it something like, build a snake game. And when you did that in chat, I actually did that, on stage in Rio de Janeiro in May 2023. I think the demo was 15 minutes in which I built snake game and I copy and pasted the code out of chat into files. And I had to know, okay, I need to open a new file. I need to save that file under a certain name. Well, if you do that in agent mode, it creates all these files for you. So it knows, the HTML goes into an index HTML and the JavaScript goes into a file and the CSS goes into a file. And it knows when you build maybe a backend application, you need to install a package. So it shows you the command that you have to run in the terminal. It doesn't run the command for you because that would be scary, running commands on my machine coming out of machine learning model. How long until one of those models deletes all my files in the project or something like that. And so you still have to click the run button, but it can figure out, okay, you need to install an NPM dependency or, a Unicorn web server, something like that. And it shows you to do that and you click run. And then at the end, you finished, the one flow and now you can try it out and run that application. And if it all works, you can just go back and define a new task and tell the agent, okay, now that we have that basic game, I want to add, an AI, a non-player character, or I want to add more obstacles, or I want to make it 3D. And the agent mode understands the context of your project, your workspace in VS Code, and so can make modification to that code base. And that actually, the bootstrapping something new, that's a cool demo. But that's not what developers do in their day-to-day. 90% of the time, you're modifying either your own code or other developers' code, right? And so having something that is available there for you in an existing code base to say, well, these are the 10 files I think you need to modify. Here's an idea of how you could modify these files. You can still, accept or reject the modifications, the diff, if you will, to those files. It's incredibly liberating for software developers. That's where, this vibe coding term comes in. You're kind of like, are in the vibe and you're defining of what you want to build and the agent does things. And because you still understand code, you have to still understand code and what you're actually doing. It creates this feedback loop between you, the agent, and the programming language that it generates. And I think many developers really find that joyful, especially with these new models like Claude 3.7 Sonnet.
Yeah. And I would say we are certainly in the agent hype sphere right now. I mean, I open LinkedIn and it is just everywhere. The amount of thought leadership of folks talking about it. And it's challenging to see the difference between what is just overblown vaporware, wishful thinking, and what is happening in reality. And so I like this example of, being able to build something on stage. But I think what you're pointing at is that, most developers are working with brownfield projects. And so that's going to be the challenge and, helping developers to modernize apps and do this sort of challenging work. I mean, we've mentioned writing tests. I mean, if agents can help with that, I think that's going to be the killer feature.
And most developers move, from project to project, whether it's just, checking out an open source library, realizing it doesn't do exactly what you want. Then you want to modify it, you fork it, you start figuring out, how has the maintainer of that open source library structured the project. So while you might be the expert in your own code base, all of a sudden you're working in somebody else's code base. And so having an agent available to just show you which files you have to modify and maybe, hint out that you have to update the Selenium tests or something like that. And then you can actually submit the pull request and you have a higher confidence level if you do that without an agent because it helped you within the context of that open source project to make the modification. And then, code review agent, maybe that comes in. And so by the time the maintainer of that open source project that you forked looks at your pull request, they're like, well, Kate, this is great. It might be your first pull request ever, but I'd love to merge this. Please send me more. And that behavior is not only true between you and an open source project, it's actually true within any decently sized company. We have teams of developers building multiple things. Moving from one team to another is actually like joining a new company of different programming language, different approach to things, maybe even a different philosophy in, is it microservices or a monolith? Certainly at the size of a GitHub or a Microsoft, we have almost everything, in terms of project size and scale and architecture. And there's a huge difference between Xbox and Office and Azure and GitHub and LinkedIn. And that's just the big titles of all these teams. And then each of them, I think at GitHub, we have over 1,000 services in our service catalog. And so you can kind of imagine how much an agent can do to help you to move from one project to another and ramp up on that project and be productive, hopefully within a couple of hours.
And you have been very explicit about, keeping that human in the loop when it comes to AI code assistance. All your blog posts seem to mention it at some point. That is my feeling as well, that the humans do need to be involved. But I feel like agents have this interesting place when it comes to humans. So let's first talk about pair programming and what you have called peer programming. So I was really interested in your post from assistant to peer programmer because you mentioned TDD here. So when it comes to Agile folks, they have resisted thinking of AI as a pair programmer. Folks on Hacker News will jump in talking about AI not being able to work in Agile or XP as a pair programmer. So, how are you thinking through that? Do you feel like Agile is going to become less relevant as we move into a more AI-assisted future?
The great thing about the internet is that there's never not a healthy argument about anything. And in fact, if nobody criticizes your work, it probably wasn't meaningful enough and maybe not even worth doing. So I think it's a good discussion to have. And actually, if you look up, on the Agile Alliance glossary, the definition of a pair programmer, it starts with saying, there's a programmer at the keyboard, and that's called the driver. And then there's the other programmer, the pair, I guess, the other side of the pair that is not involved in programming and that's focusing on the direction, and that's called the navigator. And, pilot, co-pilot, driver, navigator, I think that's actually pretty close definition-wise. Now, the question is obviously at what level of the abstraction ladder are you? And if you look at the original Copilot with code completions, right, it's very low on that abstraction ladder. The driver, the pilot types in the editor, and so it gives context. And then the navigator, the co-pilot, the other side, is taking that, the input from the driver and what else you have in the file, above the cursor, below the cursor, adjacent tabs, maybe what you typed a minute ago, and then it creates prediction of the next few lines. And so it does set the direction, but obviously at a lower abstraction level as we as humans understand our AI pair programmer, right? Like when you do, although, I've done pair programming, depending on where you are in your career journey, it might as well be that the person next to you just dictates you the proper syntax or when you do it in Objective-C or Swift doing iPhone development, a lot of the method names are very long and we didn't always have as smart auto-completions as we have today. But I think the concept actually works. I type something, I'm in control, and my Copilot gives me ideas of what I could type next. And if I don't like the direction it's going, well, I can just keep typing and I cannot accept the suggestion, not hit the tab key, or I can hit the tab key and then edit it. And because you do, these models can fill into the middle, they can actually then, when I keep editing in the middle of that suggestion, they start directing me again into that next phase. And then, after code completions, which we launched, so almost 4 years ago, June 2021, it came chat, right? Like with ChatGPT in November 2022, the whole world changed of how we think about these things. And of course, chat is even closer to a human sitting next to me because I can ask them to explain code to me, right? I can ask them dumb questions. And the nice thing actually is that I don't have to worry about judgment because the AI doesn't judge me. It has infinite patience. It just keeps answering, right? And so you can actually explore topics. One of the most earliest demos I saw of Copilot Chat was it explains a security vulnerability, a SQL injection. You can ask it show me how an attacker would exploit that vulnerability. And that's what you usually don't get from documentation or from, security trainings, that somebody shows you, okay, this is the input string that I feed into your method to exploit that SQL injection. And so I think, as we go through this journey of AI-assisted programming or AI-native software development, the Copilot does more and more become a pair or peer programmer that helps me in my day-to-day, while I stay in the middle of the process. I remain the driver or the pilot.
Okay. That all makes sense. And I think what I'm hearing then is instead of getting rid of agile programming, we're actually doubling down on it. That as everyone is increasingly getting on board with these copilots and more folks are using them, that everybody is going to be pairing in some capacity. And so maybe we just need to redefine it, or I don't know. I mean, you kind of have, because you didn't call it. Let's see. So you call it peer programming rather than pair programming. Was that on purpose? Can I ask?
It was on purpose because we wanted to explain that now that we're 4 years into this journey, the Copilot becomes more and more a member of your team and not just something that, sits in your editor and helps you. But I want to come back to something you just said, which is, I think, the Copilot being available to anyone on this planet actually teaches everyone how pair programming works. Because, when kids use Copilot to learn coding, that is effectively learning the pair programming, the underlying principle of pair programming, of exploring a topic, asking questions, processing the answer. Similar to a human, the AI doesn't always have the right answer, right? When we talk about model hallucinations, let's also be real that there's lots of wrong information on the internet. When you find code snippets, they more often don't work and you have to modify and make them work, right? Trial and error. When we, discuss between two developers how things should be, whether it's architecture or coding patterns, or do I decompose that, refactor that method into two smaller methods, there isn't a right or wrong. There's different answers to that. And I think we will, enable our kids to learn these behaviors at the earliest. I think the other side to that is that in many ways, Copilot and AI in general has been so successful with software developers because with Agile, with TDD, writing test cases, and with DevOps, code review processes, not pushing to main, but pushing to a pull request, running all my CI/CD, running my unit tests, and then having a human reviewer, or that is the code owner of that file, so they can give me feedback. These practices and these quality gates, they have enabled us to use AI to its fullest potential, while it certainly had flaws, right? Like in 2021, when Copilot launched on the Codex model, at a time when GPT-3 was the best model, it certainly wasn't perfect. That's why we only launched code completions. And yet it quickly led to developers being more productive, based on some metrics that we can get into, but also based on what developers have been telling us. And I think the best measurement that you can have on any software development tool is to ask the developers how they feel about the tool. And whether that was internally here at GitHub, or whether it was once we had launched Copilot, everybody told us, I don't want to work without Copilot anymore. And if I don't like it for a minute, because I'm, currently in a mood, or it annoys me more than it helps me because I know what I'm doing, well, Command-Shift-P, disable Copilot. It's easy enough to we know shortcuts to disable it when I need my quiet time, in the same way that, sometimes I don't want to do pair programming and I just want to code something and then I send it to pull request review and then my team or my peers will give me feedback.
Yes, that all makes sense. And I like how you have brought up the fact that this can be the kind of thing where you spend some time in deep thought, more or less by yourself. And you can also engage with the AI assistant that can enable you and help you to get a task completed, maybe in a less painful way. So I like how we're expanding the definition. And you had mentioned abstractions. That is a word I've been thinking about a lot lately. As a front-end engineer, abstractions were a big part of everything that I touched, right? As you move up the stack, that certainly is the case, whether it's compiled languages or like Vercel being a wrapper around AWS, right? So at all levels, abstraction is something that's always top of mind. But something that I've been hearing more and more is that AI is going to just become another abstraction layer. And this is something that developers are comfortable with, this idea. But I don't know. It feels different to me. Do you see an equivalence there? Would you say that it is just another layer of abstraction?
The abstraction layer is human language. It's not the AI that's
Right.
the abstraction layer. It's the human language that's the abstraction layer. And if we look at how software developers work, whether they work on their own or in a small team startups, a team of 10 or so typically don't have other roles. They just have engineers, and some of them might take more product management roles or more designer roles, or one of them has to be the CEO. So you have a CEO. But as the team grows, then you have the product management role and the designer role, which both are abstractions that the AI can process, right? Or what they output us is the abstraction. The PM outputs a specification, a description at the epic level to come back to agile, or at the user story level or at the task level. And the designer outputs, a visual abstraction of the problem. But whether you have a PM and a designer, or whether just on your own and you're working on your open source, on your hobby project, well, the ideas in your head, they're all in human language. And often they're much bigger than what you can actually implement in code. And so what we do, is we take that big idea and we decompose it into smaller ideas, and that still happens in human language, whether it's on paper or in a planning and tracking system or just a note sheet. And so you typically write that still in human language. And at some point you get to the point, okay, now I know kind of like this should go into a file or module or model view controller or this kind of things. And then you start converting the ideas that you have in human language into programming language. And that obviously is a, imperfect conversion. If it would be perfect, then we would always write code that has no bugs and that does exactly what I wanted to do right away. But that's not actually how software development works, right? It's a lot of that is exploring how to do it while we're doing it. And we're using frameworks like React or Ruby on Rails to simplify that work, because then we know where things go and how we do that decomposition process. But that's effectively why we are often no longer talk about programmers, we talk about software engineers, because it's an engineering task. It's a task that takes a very complex problem, applies, the craft that you have built over the course of your career, and it takes, the experience that you have and the constraints, that your team might be giving you, whether it's the language or the cloud or the cost that you can spend, and should it run on a mobile phone on the edge, or does it run, on a back end and everybody can open it with a browser, right? It's those decisions where you still need engineers in the process, and where the conversion from human language to programming language is simplified with the AI. The AI might write code for you, but at the end of the day, the real engineering process is not the code writing. The real engineering process is the design of the system, and then converting that design into something real.
That certainly resonates with what I'm hearing around English being the fastest growing coding language.
And German.
And German. Well, thank you. Okay. Yes. Language in general, human language. But I still feel like if we think about developer tooling, there was this black box deterministic aspect to these SaaS products that I had always thought of as being abstractions. And that's not quite what is happening with, these AI code assistants, or even the future that I'm hearing other, executive leadership talk about around that the developer tooling is going to fall off because everyone's just going to build their own bespoke solution here. It feels like there's something even more revolutionary happening, that there's like a break.
Well, I think the part that we haven't covered yet is that you're going to get to a point where, and you've asked me about agents, where an agent can take over a part of that engineering work, right? And I think that's, again, going to be the role of the engineer to figure out when can I hand it off to the agent. And with the code completions, that's a very simple example. You type and you see a prediction and you can accept it or not. And you're making decisions very binary by pressing the tab key or keep typing. But it actually forces you more into a mode where you have to both write and read at the same time to understand what if the suggestion, the prediction that you're getting, is that good enough to what you want to achieve? And is it faster for you to press the tab key and modify that? Or do you keep, specifying what you actually want to get the right prediction, or actually, to just write it all out by yourself? If we look at, agents and where we announced a few weeks ago something called Project Padawan, like Jedi and Padawan, you need a lot of patience and it needs to learn still. It's not perfect yet. Where you can assign a GitHub issue to Copilot, and then Copilot behind the scenes, you don't even see it doing its work. It spins up a compute environment, a code space. It installs all the dependencies. It checks out the code. It looks at your description. If you uploaded images, screens, Figmas, whatever, to the issue, it can also analyze that. And then it starts creating a pull request, a draft pull request, where the description outlines its plan, just like a human developer would do. And then it commits, into the pull request. And in the meantime, you, as the pilot, you can actually do something else because it runs in the background and you can focus on another task, maybe designing another component or reviewing code of the previous agent run. And at some point, you get to the pull request and you can see the work of the Padawan, of the agent, just like a human developer would have done. And you review the code. And when you don't like code, you highlight those 5 lines of code and say, well, this isn't working, or this has a bug, or refactor that in a separate method. And then Copilot can pick that up again and reformulate the pull request. And of course, as with every pull request, you can also take the GitHub CLI, GH, and check out the pull request on your local machine, open it in VS Code with Copilot, and keep working on that. And I think that's a completely new way of working as a software developer. Or it's exactly the same way we've always worked, because usually most developers work in groups of teams, and Copilot has joined as a member of your team that you can assign certain tasks to. Now, the critical thing on this is that you have to figure out, ideally before you assign the issue to the Copilot, whether Copilot can actually solve the issue. Because if you assign random stuff, not so well-defined issues, too high of an abstraction, my classic example is, you find an issue, say, build me GitHub. Now, no SWE agent can do that, right? It just doesn't work. And we as humans intrinsically know that. If I read intuitively, know that if I read that issue, I'd say, well, PM, go back and break that down into smaller chunks of work, and let's talk about what GitHub even means in this context. But an agent can do that. An agent looks at this and looks at the code base and then tries to solve their task. And as it comes back to you and generates garbage, it has burned compute cycles and it has cost you money that you don't want to spend. And if you do that over and over again, where the SWE agent now gets assigned to an issue and then cannot actually solve the issue, you get frustrated and you stop using it, as we do with all the tools now in the developer toolchain. If the tools don't do what we expect them to do, then we stop using them and move on to something else. So I think that's what the future we're heading into, where we are able to assign some work to a SWE agent, and the SWE agent does the work for us, while in other parts we still do the work with the help of a Copilot in our IDE.
I like that you brought up Project Padawan, because as I am trying to figure out what an agent even is, it's useful for me to have these examples of things that folks have tried. Talking about GitHub Copilot's agent mode, what I think really attracted me to the blog post that you wrote about that was that it had a lot of examples about what that might look like. So, recognizing errors and fixing them automatically. That makes sense, right? Suggesting terminal commands and asking you to execute them, and analyzing runtime errors. Oh, and self-healing capabilities. I really like that one as well. So yeah, so I'm collecting these. I feel like this is like my new scrapbook of what could an agent even be here? Have you added anything to this list that was with the original launch?
Test generation, I think, is the one that most developers will be excited about. You can kind of imagine you submit a pull request, the agent looks at it and figures out, or you don't have enough test cases, or you wrote some unit tests and they're all passing, but you kind of got away with the minimum amount of tests to either TDD or validate your work. There's never enough tests, or at the same time, it's also true there's always too many tests, because test suites, the bigger they get, the more flaky they become, the longer they take to run. And so having AI figure out what's the right amount of tests to cover all the code and all the scenarios, I think is going to be something many developers are excited about, and actually think about that as not AI is replacing their job, but more like the dishwasher that's doing the dishes for you while you can watch your favorite show on Netflix. I've barely met anyone that has complained that they have a dishwasher in their kitchen and that took away the work of doing the dishes. And I think that's the way I think about the right agent in our software development process, is those that do the work that we don't want to do, so we can focus on the work we love doing, and that actually keeps our motivation and energy high. And where you cannot, we all had that moment as a developer where it's late at night, but you're so in the flow, it's almost like a rush. The dopamine is flowing, and you can't stop working because I just need to finish this one thing. And I think that's, if we can get more into this flow state where developers are happy doing these things, then AI is actually on the right path. One more example, as I mentioned, pull request is, just code review.
Yes.
We at GitHub are remote first company. We have developers in many parts of the world, but even just in the United States, with its multiple time zones, the developer in New York might be waiting for his coworker on Oahu, to review the code. That's 5 or 6 hours away. If you have a Copilot, and we actually shipped that recently, if you have a Copilot reviewing your code and giving you initial feedback, saving you the embarrassment of the bugs or the syntax errors or the thing that you overlooked, you fat-fingered your commit. By the time you actually committed it and pushed it, you realized copy and pasted something into that file that shouldn't have been there. And Copilot points that out. And then by the time that coworker wakes up and looks at your pull request, everything is already great and CI/CD is passing and you already moved on to the next task. I think that's where we're going to see the true value of these agents.
Have you seen a code review agent done well yet? I hear that from everyone, that's what they want. And I don't know if that's the future or if this is, if folks are really doing this right now.
Ours is getting better, I'd say. Yeah. Nothing is perfect, but ours is getting better. These reasoning models like OpenAI's O3 mini model or Claude 3.7 Sonnet thinking are getting better at doing this because they have these reasoning capabilities or the chain of thought where they can actually get to a better state, a better outcome in the pull request review. So I'd say we are getting there. It's definitely not at the level of the human reviewer. And from a security perspective, in decent-sized companies, we will never have a state where we want to merge a pull request without a human reviewing the pull request. I think that's from a zero trust perspective, that is continue to be crucial. And so the Copilot doesn't have to be perfect in reviewing the code. It just needs to make it a little bit easier, right? Like if it makes it 10% faster from the time I submit a pull request to the pull request being deployed, well, I take that trade-off any day and have Copilot, in all my pull requests. Worst case, it says I have nothing to say, which is sometimes funny because, it's the hard part about user interface design. It can either not say anything and then you don't know if it got finished or if it's still running or stuck, or it can tell you that it has nothing found. And then you're like, well, why are you telling me that? Why are you, sending me a GitHub notification? So I think we are going through, the evolution of these capabilities. We're pretty happy where the current version is, but there's certainly more to come as the models become more powerful and we learn more and more of how to build these AI systems.
And I think that particularly applies when we think about the bugs that are being introduced by AI.
We did recently a quality statistic. I'm not sure I remember enough data, but I think the gist of it was that the code written with AI versus code written without AI was about on par in terms of quality and had higher test coverage and better documentation as you would expect. And then so the argument you could make is that, well, if the AI code is about as good as the code written without AI, but has higher test coverage, better documentation, has higher developer satisfaction, and is written faster, because that's what most of the studies show, that developers are, in real life, something in the range of 25 to 30% faster, in case studies, up to 55%. But obviously these case studies are exactly that. They're like artificial scenarios that don't easily convert into reality. But let's say 25% faster. Well, if I'm 25% faster with the same level of quality, that's a great deal.
Right. Yes. Those are the statistics you'd want. All right. I think we should start wrapping this up, but I want to end on a nice high science fiction note here. So what are you thinking about in terms of a roadmap? What should developers be looking for? How are agents going to change every aspect of their day-to-day lives?
We definitely will have more agents, totally in the context of this very agentic podcast. The cool thing about the VS Code project is that VS Code team, for I think ever since they started 10 years ago, have been in monthly iterations. And some of the plans are public and others are in private. But there's going to be a new version of VS Code every month. What's currently being worked on is in VS Code Insiders. And so we want to follow along of what's happening with GitHub Copilot in VS Code. You can just download VS Code Insiders and you can try out new features before we even announce them as they're exposed through Insiders. We're going to see more models. We're going to see with these models the agent mode becoming better and being able to cover more scenarios. I think we're going to significantly rethink what that means from a user interface perspective when you're constantly working, between the text, the files you're editing and the agent itself. And then we're going to, evolve the Padawan hopefully into a Jedi that can actually be assigned to your issues, and you can predict what it does and you can steer it. You can tolerate it. It doesn't annoy you the whole time with lots of notifications or errors or breaking your CI/CD, and then you verify the output, and you keep that loop going. And I think during 2025, we're going to see more and more evolutions, not only from us, on SWE-bench. You can see many companies in many fields actually now building their own SWE agents and competing in the SWE-bench benchmarks. And so I think we're going to see a really good competitive environment that is all focused on what we love doing at GitHub, which is making developers happy and productive. So yeah, I think that's 2025 is any year for GitHub, another version of what the founders started almost 18 years ago when they launched the first version of GitHub, which is create something that developers love using every single day.
Well, I think that will get everyone excited. All right. So talk to me about how folks can keep up with all these new and exciting things happening at GitHub and your meditations on them.
My meditations on them. Well, GitHub blog, the GitHub social channels on X, on LinkedIn, and other social networks. I'm Ash Tom on GitHub, on X, on LinkedIn, and you see me at various conferences. We're not too far away from Microsoft Build in May 19th in Seattle. I will be speaking at VIA Developers in Berlin and July, and more announcements coming soon on my social channels.
Fantastic. And I will include those in the show notes. I have really enjoyed speaking with you today, Thomas. Again, my name is Kate Holterhoff, Senior Analyst at RedMonk. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and review the Monkcast on your podcast platform of choice. If you are watching us on RedMonk's YouTube channel, please like, subscribe, and engage with us in the comments.
Bye.